girded his arguments. So before we get into the specifics of your ethical positions, tell me what makes you so sure that your version of Darwin that's informing your ethics is the right Darwin.
Well, I'm not particularly wedded to Darwin as such. I'm wedded to an evolutionary understanding of how we got here and of what human nature is like. So it's not really for me a question of arguing about how best to interpret Darwin. It's really a matter of looking at the best scientific view of what we are like and what the world is like. And so that's obviously not Darwin's anymore because science moves on. But I think it's the current evolutionary theorists and evolutionary psychologists are working within a broadly Darwinian framework. I don't actually think, by the way, let me make this clear because you've been talking about ethics and Darwin quite a lot. I don't think that any ethical conclusions follow from Darwin or what Darwin wrote, or for that matter from evolutionary theory as such. I think that people who believe that because of evolution, therefore, there's some ethical imperative to promote the survival of the fittest was simply mistaken. They were committing a fallacy that philosophers call the naturalistic fallacy. In that sense, there's a difference between facts and values, and Darwinian theory is at the level of facts. It's describing what the universe is like, and it doesn't tell us what we ought to do. But I do think that in trying to work out what we ought to do, it obviously helps to have a sound understanding of what we're like, what human nature is capable of. And that's where I think a Darwinian understanding is helpful to going about trying to work out what is an ethic that will actually suit human beings.
I want to get into a few of the big ethical questions you've addressed throughout your career. First, let's talk about end-of-life issues, euthanasia, physician-assisted suicide. In Portland, there's a law that's been on the books for about 10 years that permits physicians to help terminally ill and suffering patients to kill themselves. It might just be a coincidence, but I note that the highest rate of unbelief in the U.S. is in the Pacific Northwest, in the area where Portland is. Do you think that in a completely secular society, it necessarily follows that we're going to be much more willing to support suicide and euthanasia? In a sense, this kind of proves the point of the religious right when they say that secularism and atheism will necessarily lead to a devaluing of human life. You're actually kind of arguing that we should value human life a little less than we have traditionally.
It depends what you call valuing human life. I mean, what I call valuing human life is allowing the human beings who are living that life to decide for themselves when it's a life that's worth living, and to decide for themselves when, because they're terminally ill, perhaps dying of cancer or some painful disease, it's no longer worth living. So I would say we allow the individuals to put their own value on life when they're obviously mentally competent and thinking calmly and taking some time to make that decision. And that's what the law that you referred to, which actually applies to the state of Oregon, not just to Portland, that's what it does. And there are a couple of other countries that have similar laws, or ones that actually allow active euthanasia as well, like the Netherlands and Belgium. And
right.
So I think that in those countries, what people really value is the individual right to decide if your life is worth living. And yes, I would say that if you have a secular society, then you're free from this idea that somehow God's the one who's going to decide when you live or die, and it's your duty to maintain your life as long until God takes it from you or something like that. I mean, because I don't believe any of that, I ask myself the question, well, who is in the best position to decide when your life is no longer worth living? And my answer is, if you're mentally competent, thinking calmly, you are.
It's also this argument against the sanctity of human life. It's not just a matter of that it's my right to decide, but also since there is no sanctity of human life is in no sense sacred, that we can't argue the state should protect people from ending such a sacred human life.
Well, that's true. I don't accept the idea that there is such a thing as the sanctity of human life. That, again, I think is essentially a religious notion. And I don't see that the state, therefore, would have a role to play in protecting that. The state can have a role to play in ensuring that these decisions are made by people who are mentally competent, or that they're made in a proper way, that there's no abuses or attempts to sort of put pressure on people to end their lives. I think the state can have a role in that sense, but I don't think it should be trying to force people to stay alive against their will.
You mentioned the Netherlands and active euthanasia that occurs there. They don't do only a physician-assisted suicide, but they've engaged in killing severely disabled infants. It's not just a voluntary decision of a mentally competent, terminally ill and suffering patient to end his or her life, but parents or physicians saying this severely disabled baby has no good life prospects in our judgment, so let's, do the right thing, in quotes, and kill it. But this is kind of the slippery slope that a lot of people in America are so afraid of. It's exactly what the pro-life cultural conservatives say physician-assisted suicide is going to lead to. This active euthanasia position is by definition kind of anti-life or anti-kind of life at all costs. You could argue that it's pro-quality of life or something like that.
Yes, it's certainly anti-life at all costs, and I think that's right. I don't believe that life is always a value, no matter what its quality might be. It is about quality of life. In terms of non-voluntary euthanasia in the Netherlands, euthanasia of severely disabled infants, it does happen, but I think on a very small scale. I think there was a paper published by one of the leading hospitals which talked about 22 cases in 7 years, so about 3 cases a year. And always the parents were fully consulted and briefed by the doctors, and they were really pretty hopeless cases. I think, people ought to realize that it's not all that different from what goes on in major hospitals in this country, where doctors and parents decide to withdraw life support.
To pull the plug.
Yeah, to pull the plug, exactly. And that happens, and nobody really, or very few people, seem to object to that. I haven't seen protests outside hospitals that acknowledge that they do that. I think that the Dutch are really right to say, look, there's not a very big distinction between saying this baby's prognosis is so bad that we should turn off the life support, and saying, well, this baby's prognosis is so bad that it's better that it not go on living. And since this baby is not on life support, we can't end that baby's life by pulling the plug, but we can end the baby's life by giving a lethal injection. I think what's important is the decision whether the baby should live or die on the basis of the baby's condition, and of course the consultation with the parents. It's not so important whether death comes because you're able to turn off a respirator or because you give a lethal injection. They're both sort of technical means of achieving the same end.
So quality of life is much more a value to you than quantity of life.
Yes, I think that's right. I think, as I said, normally with someone who's competent able to understand the issues, that person ought to be the one who makes the decision. But where you have severely disabled infants, I think that somebody else has to, and I think the parents and physicians working together in consultation are the ones to make it. At the other end of life, I think people ought to be able to make living wills, not just to say, I don't want to have life support if it should happen that I'm in such and such a state, as people do, but they should also say, I don't want to go on living. I mean, I would say that. I would say that if I suffer from Alzheimer's and get to the point where I can no longer recognize my children, I'm not capable of reading or of discussing anything with anyone, and I'm just lying there in bed, I don't want to go on living. I think that's not how I would like to see myself as ending. So I think I ought to have that right to make that decision as well. Let me add, by the way, that when people who are religious say that they are pro-life and they are appalled by this handful of cases in the Netherlands of doctors who end the lives of severely disabled babies, I would say if they're really pro-life, there's lots of lives that you can save around the world, which really is where they should be putting their energy. I mean, the United States has a really, for a developed industrialized country, a very high rate of infant mortality.
And that's because of our horrible healthcare system, you're saying?